Sometimes the smallest abuse of power destroys the biggest career because arrogance never imagines someone is quietly collecting the truth. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning in downtown Atlanta, where commuters hurried along sidewalks with steaming coffee cups, delivery trucks squeezed through narrow streets, and courthouse employees checked their watches before another demanding day. Nothing about the morning hinted that by sunset, one impulsive decision would ignite a legal battle that every major news station in Georgia would soon be covering. Officer Tyler Hawkins leaned casually against his patrol cruiser, twirling a tow authorization form between his fingers while watching traffic crawl past the courthouse plaza. For nearly 12 years, he had worn the badge with confidence, believing experience gave him permission to decide who deserved courtesy and who deserved inconvenience. Across the street, parked neatly inside a clearly marked legal parking zone, sat a dark blue Lincoln Navigator with a valid government permit displayed on the dashboard. It wasn't blocking traffic. It wasn't parked illegally. It wasn't creating any hazard. Yet Tyler couldn't stop staring at it. He had noticed the vehicle several mornings in a row and had convinced himself that its owner acted as though the rules didn't apply. People like that always think they're untouchable, he muttered under his breath as another officer walked by without paying attention. He never checked the permit closely. He never called parking enforcement for clarification. Instead, irritation slowly became justification. Less than 5 minutes later, Tyler reached for his radio and calmly requested a towing company, describing the SUV as an unauthorized vehicle occupying restricted government access. The dispatcher asked a routine question. "Are you confirming the violation?" Tyler answered without hesitation. "Affirmative." Those single words would later echo through depositions, courtroom recordings, and internal investigations. While the tow truck made its way toward the courthouse, the owner of the SUV sat 3 floors above the street inside a conference room reviewing witness statements for a public corruption hearing scheduled later that morning. Terrence Walker, the county's district attorney, had earned a reputation that reached far beyond the courthouse walls. Colleagues described him as disciplined, thoughtful, and remarkably calm under pressure. Defense attorneys respected him even when they opposed him because he argued facts instead of emotions. He believed justice meant applying the law consistently, regardless of someone's title, wealth, or background. That belief had guided every major decision of his career. He never imagined he would spend that morning becoming the target of an abuse of authority instead of presenting a case against one. Outside, the heavy tow truck rolled quietly into the plaza. A few pedestrians slowed down, assuming another illegally parked vehicle was being removed. Tyler folded his arms with visible satisfaction as steel equipment locked onto the front tires of the SUV. Someone passing by hesitated and glanced toward the windshield. "Officer, are you sure that's supposed to be towed?" the man asked politely. Tyler barely looked at him before replying, "Mind your own business. Everything is under control." Several courthouse employees watched from the entrance, exchanging uncertain looks. Something about the situation didn't feel right, but no one stepped forward. Within minutes, the SUV disappeared around the corner behind the tow truck, leaving behind nothing except an empty parking space and a decision that seemed insignificant to everyone except the man who had made it. Tyler smiled to himself, convinced he had just taught an entitled stranger a lesson. What he didn't realize was that the paperwork he had casually signed was already beginning to tell a very different story, one that would soon place his own name under far greater scrutiny than the owner of the vehicle he had just sent away. Terrence Walker remained focused on the hearing unfolding inside the conference room, completely unaware that the empty parking space outside was about to become the least important part of his day. He listened carefully as investigators reviewed financial records connected to a public corruption case that had taken nearly 18 months to build. Every document had been verified. Every witness had been interviewed more than once. Terrence had spent his entire career believing that justice was strongest when it relied on patience instead of emotion. That philosophy had earned him both admiration and criticism. Some called him relentless. Others called him impossible to intimidate. He accepted both descriptions without complaint because neither mattered as much as the truth. When the meeting concluded, he thanked every member of his team before gathering his legal folder and walking toward the courthouse entrance. The bright Georgia sun reflected against the glass buildings across the street as he reached the sidewalk, but something immediately felt different. His eyes drifted toward the place where he always parked before work. The space was empty. For a brief moment, he questioned his own memory. Perhaps he had parked on another block. Perhaps he had forgotten after arriving early that morning. He quietly retraced each step in his mind until certainty settled in. No, his vehicle had been exactly where it belonged. One of the courthouse security officers noticed him scanning the street and approached with an uncertain expression. "Looking for your SUV, Mr. Walker?" Terrence nodded calmly. "Yes. Was there construction this morning?" The guard hesitated before answering. "No, sir. A tow truck came by around an hour ago." Officer Tyler Hawkins signed the paperwork himself. Terrence did not react with anger. He simply asked, "Did anyone explain the reason?" The guard slowly shook his head. "Not that I heard." Terrence thanked him and continued walking toward the police cruiser parked near the courthouse steps. Tyler Hawkins stood beside the driver's door, speaking casually with another officer, smiling as if nothing unusual had happened. When he noticed Terrence approaching, his expression shifted into one of practiced authority. "Can I help you?" he asked. Terrence kept his voice even and respectful. "Good morning, officer. I believe my government vehicle was towed by mistake. I would appreciate knowing which towing company received the authorization." Tyler folded his arms. If it was towed, there was probably a reason. Terrence maintained steady eye contact. "I understand procedures exist for a reason. I'm only asking where my vehicle was taken." Tyler shrugged dismissively. "You can figure that out the same way everyone else does." Several people walking into the courthouse slowed their pace, sensing the conversation becoming uncomfortable. Terrence refused to match Tyler's tone. "May I at least have the incident report number?" Tyler smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more pride than courtesy. "Maybe next time, you should pay attention to where you park." Terrence glanced toward the empty parking space one final time before returning his attention to the officer. "The permit displayed on my dashboard authorizes parking in that location during official courthouse business." Tyler interrupted before he could finish. "That is your opinion." The words lingered in the warm morning air. Imagine standing there knowing you had followed every rule, asking simple questions, and receiving nothing except dismissal. Most people would have argued. Many would have raised their voices. Terrence did neither. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, removed a small notebook, and quietly wrote down the officer's name, badge number, patrol unit, the exact time, and the names of 2 courthouse employees who had witnessed the exchange. Tyler watched with growing amusement, convinced he was observing an empty gesture. He had no idea that the calm man standing before him had spent years teaching young prosecutors that the smallest facts often became the strongest evidence, and that the first person to lose emotional control usually surrendered the strongest legal position. Terrence Walker left the courthouse plaza without another word, but silence did not mean surrender. He understood something that many people overlooked in moments of conflict. Every careless decision created a trail, and every trail eventually led to the truth. Instead of wasting valuable time arguing on the sidewalk, he borrowed a temporary county vehicle and arrived at the afternoon hearing only minutes before proceedings began. Not a single member of his legal team heard him complain about what had happened. The hearing remained his priority because dozens of citizens had placed their trust in the office he represented, and he refused to allow a personal inconvenience to interfere with public responsibility. Throughout the afternoon, however, courthouse employees quietly discussed the unusual towing incident. Several admitted they had seen the government permit clearly displayed on the dashboard before the vehicle disappeared. Others recalled hearing Officer Tyler Hawkins insist that the authorization was valid even though no parking supervisor had been consulted. Each conversation sounded insignificant on its own, yet together they formed pieces of a much larger picture. After court adjourned, Terrence walked directly to the municipal towing office to recover his vehicle. The clerk behind the counter greeted him politely before searching the computer system. Her expression changed almost immediately. "That is strange," she said softly. "The reason listed here says unauthorized parking in a restricted government access area." Terrence remained composed. "Can you also tell me what time the authorization was entered?" She turned the monitor slightly toward herself and checked the electronic record. 9:14 this morning. Terrence nodded. "Would you please print a complete copy of the intake record, including the authorization number and the officer identification attached to it?" The clerk hesitated only long enough to verify that the request complied with public record policy. Moments later, several printed pages slid across the counter. Terrence thanked her sincerely before paying the towing and storage fees without objection. The clerk looked almost apologetic. Most people would be very upset. Terrence offered a faint smile. Anger rarely improves documentation. As he stepped outside, he carefully placed every receipt, invoice, and printed record inside a folder already filled with legal notes from the morning hearing. Across town, Tyler Hawkins ended his shift feeling unusually satisfied. During dinner with two fellow officers at a neighborhood restaurant, he joked about teaching courthouse employees that nobody was above the rules. One officer laughed politely, but another looked uncertain. "Did you verify the permit before calling the tow?" Tyler waved away the question. It looked suspicious enough. His partner quietly stirred his coffee before responding. Suspicion is not always the same as policy. Tyler shrugged without concern. Nothing is going to happen over one vehicle. Back at his office, Terrence sat alone reviewing every document collected that day. He compared the towing authorization with county parking regulations, then opened the official courthouse permit policy available on the county website. Line by line, the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. The designated parking area matched the permit exactly. The listed violation did not exist under county code. Even more surprising, the electronic authorization appeared to have skipped two required approval steps normally completed before any government vehicle could be removed from courthouse property. Terrence leaned back in his chair and looked through the office window as evening settled over the city skyline. He was not thinking about revenge. He was thinking about procedure. If one official document contained errors, how many others might exist? If one officer ignored established safeguards, how often had that happened before? The questions grew heavier with every page he reviewed. By the time the courthouse lights began switching off one floor at a time, Terrence had reached a quiet conclusion. Recovering his vehicle had never been the real issue. Discovering whether the system itself had quietly failed the people it was supposed to protect had become far more important. The following morning, Terrence Walker arrived at his office before sunrise, just as he had done for years. The courthouse corridors were still quiet, the polished floors reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights, while custodians finished their final rounds. He placed the folder containing every receipt, regulation, and towing record on his desk before opening a fresh legal notebook. Across the top of the first page, he wrote 6 simple words. Facts first, conclusions later. It was a lesson he had repeated to every young prosecutor who had ever worked under him. Assumptions won headlines. Facts won cases. Rather than contacting the police department directly, Terrence submitted formal public records requests through the proper legal channels. He requested dispatch recordings, body camera retention notices, towing authorization logs, parking enforcement communications, and maintenance records for the government parking zone. Every request followed established procedure. Every signature was documented. Every deadline was recorded. Nothing depended upon his position. Everything depended upon the law. By late morning, news of the requests quietly spread through city offices. Clerks exchanged curious glances. Administrative assistants whispered near elevators. Even courthouse deputies wondered why the district attorney seemed unusually interested in a routine towing incident. Most assumed the matter would disappear after a brief explanation. They had no idea that Terrence was not investigating a missing vehicle anymore. He was testing whether public authority had been exercised according to established rules. Across town, Officer Tyler Hawkins remained remarkably confident. During roll call, he joked with several officers that some government lawyer had become overly sensitive about parking regulations. A few laughed politely, but others remained silent. Sergeant William Harper, a supervisor known for his careful attention to policy, overheard part of the conversation and asked one direct question. "Did you complete every required verification before requesting the tow?" Tyler answered almost immediately. The vehicle looked like it did not belong there. The room became noticeably quieter. The sergeant waited another moment before speaking again. Looking like it does not belong and proving it does not belong are two different things. Tyler forced a smile. Everything was handled. The conversation ended, but uncertainty lingered long after the officers left the briefing room. Meanwhile, the first public records responses began arriving at the district attorney's office. One email contained dispatch timestamps. Another confirmed the towing request had been entered without a documented verification from parking administration. Shortly afterward, courthouse security voluntarily provided surveillance footage, preserving the entire sequence of events. The recordings showed the government permit clearly visible through the windshield before the tow truck arrived. They also showed no attempt by anyone to inspect the permit more closely before authorizing removal. Terrence watched the footage twice without saying a word. Then he quietly placed a copy into the evidence folder beside the printed regulations. Imagine discovering that the truth does not appear through dramatic revelations, but through ordinary details that nobody expected anyone to examine. A timestamp, a signature, a policy manual, a camera mounted high above a courthouse entrance. Together, those ordinary details often carried more weight than the loudest accusation. By the end of the afternoon, another unexpected development reached Terrence's office. A local civil rights attorney called requesting a brief meeting. She explained that after hearing courthouse employees discuss the towing incident, two business owners and a retired school principal believed they had experienced nearly identical situations involving the same officer over the previous 2 years. Each described being told that no appeal would accomplish anything. Each had quietly paid towing fees and moved on with life. Terrence listened carefully without making promises. He simply asked whether they had preserved receipts, photographs, or correspondence. All three answered yes. As the meeting concluded, he looked once more at the growing stack of documents spread across his conference table. What had appeared to be one isolated decision was beginning to resemble something far more serious. And for the first time since the empty parking space outside the courthouse, Terrence realized the coming investigation might reach well beyond a single officer and into practices that had remained unquestioned for far too long over the next several days. The investigation unfolded with the quiet precision of a clock whose gears had been turning unnoticed for years. Terrence Walker never spoke publicly about the incident, never criticized the police department during interviews, and never allowed frustration to influence his judgment. Instead, he relied on the same principle that had guided every successful prosecution of his career. Let the evidence speak before anyone else does. Inside a secure conference room at the district attorney's office, the growing collection of documents covered nearly the entire length of a polished oak table. Dispatch logs sat beside parking regulations. Surveillance photographs rested next to towing invoices. Every page was labeled with the date, time, source, and chain of custody. Young assistant prosecutors who entered the room immediately understood they were looking at far more than a disagreement over one vehicle. Terrence invited each of them to study the documents without offering his own opinion. "Tell me what you see," he said. One attorney noticed that several towing authorizations approved by Officer Tyler Hawkins shared nearly identical wording, even though the reported violations involved different locations. Another pointed out that multiple authorizations had been entered only minutes apart, making it unlikely that complete inspections had actually been performed. A third attorney compared the dispatch records with courthouse surveillance footage and discovered small but important gaps between the official timeline and what the cameras had captured. None of these details alone proved intentional misconduct, yet together they revealed a troubling pattern that demanded careful examination. Later that afternoon, the three citizens who had contacted the office arrived carrying folders of their own. An elderly retired school principal unfolded faded receipts she had saved for almost 18 months because, in her words, something never felt right. A restaurant owner produced photographs showing his legally displayed permit before his truck had been removed from a downtown loading zone. Another business owner quietly explained how he had lost an entire day of work after being told there was no practical way to challenge the towing decision. Their stories differed in circumstance, but each one shared the same underlying theme. They had believed the system would not listen, so they had accepted the loss and moved on. Terrence listened without interrupting, taking careful notes instead of making emotional statements. Before they left, he thanked each person for preserving their records. Justice often depends on ordinary people who choose not to throw important papers away, he said with quiet sincerity. Meanwhile, Officer Tyler Hawkins noticed subtle changes inside his own department. Conversations stopped when he entered briefing rooms. Supervisors requested copies of reports he had completed months earlier. Internal record staff contacted him twice, requesting clarification about routine towing authorizations from previous cases. Although no accusations had been made, the atmosphere felt different. For the first time, Tyler began reviewing his own paperwork, expecting to find nothing unusual. Yet the more pages he examined, the more difficult it became to remember why certain decisions had been made. Some forms contained brief explanations. Others contained almost none at all. Imagine believing that forgotten paperwork disappears with time, only to discover that every signature quietly waits for the day someone decides to read it carefully. By the end of the week, Terrence assembled his legal team once more. No voices were raised. No dramatic speeches filled the room. He simply placed the newest evidence beside the existing files and looked around the table. "This case is no longer about my vehicle," he said calmly. "It is about whether authority was exercised fairly, consistently, and lawfully." The room remained silent because everyone understood the significance of those words. If the evidence continued pointing in the same direction, the consequences would reach far beyond one towing decision. They would test the integrity of an entire process that thousands of citizens trusted every single day. Early the following week, the growing file crossed an invisible line. What had begun as a careful review of one questionable towing decision had evolved into a comprehensive legal record supported by documents, recordings, witness statements, and official policies that all pointed toward the same troubling conclusion. Terrence Walker understood that personal involvement could easily become the focus of public attention, so he deliberately stepped back from directing the next phase himself. Instead, he submitted the complete evidence package through the established legal process, requesting an independent review by Internal Affairs and the County Ethics Office. The request was precise, professional, and supported by hundreds of pages of organized documentation. There were no dramatic accusations. There was only one simple question. Did the available evidence demonstrate that official authority had been exercised according to law and departmental policy? Within 48 hours, investigators acknowledged receipt of the materials and immediately issued preservation notices for electronic records connected to the incident. Dispatch communications, body camera files, vehicle location data, computer login histories, towing authorization records, and internal messaging logs were all secured before any routine deletion schedules could remove them. The investigation had officially moved beyond speculation. Inside police headquarters, supervisors received formal instructions prohibiting any alteration of reports related to the towing authorization. Officers were reminded to preserve notebooks, shift logs, and communication records connected to that morning outside the courthouse. The atmosphere inside the building changed almost overnight. Conversations became shorter. Casual jokes disappeared. Everyone understood that independent investigators were no longer examining opinions. They were examining evidence. Officer Tyler Hawkins tried to convince himself that the review would end quickly. After all, he believed the incident involved only one vehicle and one decision made during a routine patrol shift. Yet each passing day brought another request from investigators asking him to explain a specific report, a particular radio transmission, or an authorization form completed months earlier. He answered every question, but certainty slowly gave way to hesitation. Details that once seemed insignificant now carried unexpected importance. Every sentence he had written was being compared against digital records that could not forget. Meanwhile, investigators interviewed courthouse employees one by one. The security officer who had watched the tow truck arrive described seeing the government permit displayed on the windshield before the vehicle was removed. Administrative staff confirmed that no emergency restrictions had been issued for the parking area that morning. Even the towing company driver explained that he had relied entirely upon the officer's authorization and had observed nothing suggesting the vehicle itself violated posted regulations. Each witness described ordinary events without exaggeration, yet every statement strengthened the consistency of the timeline already established through documents and surveillance footage. Imagine discovering that the strongest case is not built by one dramatic revelation, but by dozens of ordinary people independently describing the exact same truth. A receptionist remembers the time on the lobby clock. A maintenance worker recalls seeing the permit through the windshield. A dispatcher confirms a radio transmission. None of them believes they hold the key to the investigation. Yet together they create a picture too complete to ignore. By the end of the week, Internal Affairs completed its preliminary review and quietly informed city leadership that the matter involved potential procedural failures extending beyond a single towing authorization. Additional files would require examination, and outside legal counsel recommended preparing for possible civil litigation if the evidence continued developing in the same direction. Terrence read the notification without celebration. He closed the folder, looked out across the courthouse square where the entire chain of events had quietly begun, and reflected on how easily one moment of unnecessary pride had grown into a question that now challenged the credibility of an entire institution. The independent investigation remained confidential, but confidentiality did not prevent the truth from moving quietly through City Hall. Senior officials received regular briefings. Department leaders reviewed policy manuals that had not been opened in years, and attorneys representing the county began preparing for difficult questions they hoped would never reach a public courtroom. Terrence Walker continued reporting to work every morning exactly as he always had. He prosecuted criminal cases, met with victims, reviewed evidence, and attended community meetings without mentioning the investigation unless someone asked directly. When reporters attempted to obtain comments outside the courthouse, he answered with the same measured response every time. The legal process deserves the opportunity to work without unnecessary public speculation. His consistency earned respect from people on every side of the issue. Inside police headquarters, however, the atmosphere had become impossible to ignore. Officer Tyler Hawkins noticed that his patrol assignments had quietly changed. Administrative reviews delayed several routine requests. Supervisors began accompanying him on selected evaluations, and every report he submitted received an additional level of review before approval. Nobody accused him openly, yet the confidence that had once defined his daily routine slowly disappeared. Every ringing telephone seemed capable of bringing another request for clarification. Every email carried the possibility of another document investigators wanted him to explain. Then the first major development arrived. Internal Affairs completed its analysis of the digital evidence and formally compared Tyler's written authorization with dispatch recordings, surveillance footage, permit regulations, and electronic activity logs. The conclusion was difficult to dispute. Multiple procedural requirements had not been completed before the towing authorization was issued, and the available evidence did not support the stated reason recorded on the official documentation. Investigators also confirmed that the government parking permit had been clearly visible from several camera angles before the vehicle was removed. The findings remained administrative rather than criminal, but their significance reached far beyond departmental discipline. County attorneys immediately recognized that the documented procedural failures substantially increased the city's exposure to civil liability. Imagine sitting in a conference room where every screen displays the same timeline from a different angle, and every angle tells exactly the same story. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontations. Just facts aligning with facts until there is almost no room left for doubt. That was the moment when the discussion quietly shifted from whether mistakes had occurred to how extensive the consequences might become. Attorneys representing several of the previously identified citizens requested access to public investigative records as they became available under state law. What had once appeared to be isolated experiences now formed a broader pattern worthy of independent legal review. Within days, formal notices of potential civil claims reached the county's legal department. Insurance representatives requested copies of investigative summaries. Risk management officials scheduled emergency meetings. Budget analysts began estimating the financial impact if multiple claims proceeded together. The conversation was no longer about towing fees. It had become a discussion about public trust, accountability, and the cost of abandoning established procedures. Tyler sat alone in the department break room late one afternoon, reading portions of departmental policy that he had not examined closely since the police academy. Line after line described verification requirements, documentation standards, and the obligation to exercise authority without personal bias or unnecessary discretion. The words felt strangely different now than they had years earlier. They no longer appeared to be routine instructions printed inside an employee handbook. They read like promises made to every citizen the department had sworn to serve. Across the courthouse plaza, Terrence closed another successful day by placing the investigation folder inside a secure cabinet. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He understood that genuine justice rarely felt like victory because it demanded accountability from institutions that existed to protect the public. Outside, the evening sun settled behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the same parking space. Where an ordinary morning had quietly set extraordinary consequences into motion, the official findings were released quietly on a rainy Thursday morning. Not through dramatic headlines or crowded press conferences, but through a series of formal memorandums delivered to city leadership, the police department, and county legal counsel. Yet within hours, the documents began spreading through every office connected to local government. Attorneys read every page carefully. Department supervisors compare the conclusions against existing policies. Community leaders requested briefings. The language remained measured and professional, but its meaning was unmistakable. The investigation concluded that established procedures had not been followed, required verification steps had been bypassed, and official documentation contained information that could not be supported by the available evidence. For the county, the legal consequences were immediate. Outside counsel recommended resolving the matter before additional claims expanded into prolonged litigation. Negotiations began with the individuals whose documentation had helped reveal the broader pattern. Financial experts calculated potential exposure, while city officials considered the long-term cost of defending actions that the investigative record no longer supported. What had started with one improperly authorized tow had evolved into one of the most significant administrative reviews the department had experienced in years. Officer Tyler Hawkins was summoned to police headquarters for a final administrative meeting. The conference room felt unusually quiet as senior supervisors placed the completed investigation on the table in front of him. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody attempted to embarrass him. They simply reviewed the documented facts one final time. The surveillance footage, the dispatch records, the towing authorization, the policy requirements, the witness statements. Each piece had been independently verified, and together they formed a record that could not be reasonably dismissed. Tyler listened without interruption. For the first time since that morning outside the courthouse, he stopped searching for explanations and began recognizing the weight of his own decisions. When the meeting ended, he was informed that his employment with the department would be terminated in accordance with departmental policy and applicable employment procedures. He removed his identification, signed the required documents, and quietly left the building through the same front entrance he had walked through hundreds of times before. There were no reporters waiting outside. No cheating crowds. only a light rain falling across the empty parking lot as another officer respectfully held the door open for him. Imagine discovering that careers rarely end because of one single moment. They end because one decision reveals habits that no longer withstand honest examination. The signature on one form becomes connected to another. One overlooked procedure leads investigators toward another unanswered question. Eventually, the evidence begins telling a story that no explanation can rewrite. Across the street at the county courthouse, Terrence Walker received confirmation that the county had reached a substantial civil settlement with the affected parties while also committing to comprehensive policy reforms. New verification procedures would be implemented before any government-authorized tow could occur near courthouse property. Additional supervisory approval would become mandatory in similar situations. Annual training on procedural fairness, documentation standards, and impartial decision-making would be expanded throughout the department. Terrence read the final agreement slowly before closing the folder. Several members of his staff congratulated him, believing he must feel satisfied after weeks of careful work. He simply thanked them and returned to reviewing another case scheduled for trial the following morning. To him, the outcome had never been about winning. It had always been about restoring confidence that public authority must answer to the same law it was entrusted to enforce. As evening settled over downtown Atlanta once again, the courthouse lights reflected across the wet pavement outside. The same parking space that had once stood empty now looked completely ordinary. Yet everyone who understood what had happened there knew it had become something far greater than a place to leave a vehicle. It had become a reminder that the strongest foundation of justice is not power, but accountability. Several weeks later, the city felt different in ways that could not be measured by newspaper headlines or official reports. New signs marked the courthouse parking area with clear instructions. Updated verification procedures were posted inside police briefing rooms. Supervisors spent extra time reviewing documentation before approving enforcement actions. To most people passing through downtown Atlanta, these changes appeared small, almost invisible. Yet for those who understood how they came to exist, they represented something much greater than administrative reform. They represented a promise that public trust deserved to be earned every single day. Terrence Walker continued arriving at the courthouse before sunrise, carrying the same worn leather briefcase he had used for years. His schedule had not become easier. Criminal cases still demanded long hours. Victims still deserved compassion. Families still searched for answers inside courtrooms where every decision mattered. Nothing about his daily routine suggested he viewed himself as the central figure in an extraordinary story. In fact, if someone unfamiliar with recent events had watched him crossing the courthouse plaza each morning, they would have seen only another public servant quietly preparing for another demanding day. One afternoon, a young law student participating in the county internship program asked him a question that had been lingering in many people's minds. How did you stay so calm when everything happened? Terrence paused for a moment before answering. Because anger can attract attention, he said softly, but patience uncovers the truth. The student nodded thoughtfully, writing the sentence into a notebook that would likely stay with him long after the internship ended. Across the city, conversations about the investigation slowly faded from public attention as new stories replaced old ones. That is how communities often move forward. The headlines disappear. First, the lessons remain much longer. Training academies began using portions of the investigation as instructional material about documentation, accountability, and professional judgment. Supervisors reminded new officers that authority was never intended to replace careful decision-making. Public service required discipline long before it required confidence. Somewhere beyond the courthouse district, Tyler Hawkins quietly began rebuilding his own life outside law enforcement. Those who knew him hoped he would eventually understand that accountability was not created to destroy people, but to protect the public's confidence in institutions that depended upon integrity. Whether that understanding arrived immediately or years later was something only time could answer. Imagine standing in the same parking space where this story began. There is no damaged vehicle, no flashing lights, no crowd gathered to watch history unfold. Just ordinary pavement beneath an ordinary morning sky. Yet sometimes the most important moments leave behind nothing visible at all. They remain inside the choices people make afterward, inside the procedure strengthened because someone finally asked the right questions, and inside the quiet determination of individuals who refuse to let fairness become optional. Before leaving his office one evening, Terrence looked through the courthouse window toward the city beyond. The lights stretched across the skyline as workers headed home. Families gathered for dinner, and another ordinary day came to a close. He switched off the lamp on his desk, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the elevator with the same calm confidence he had carried from the very beginning. He knew the law would never be perfect because people were not perfect, but he also believed that every honest act of accountability brought justice one step closer to the people it existed to serve. And perhaps that is the quiet truth too many forget. Power can demand obedience for a moment, but integrity earns respect for a lifetime. In the end, the empty parking space was never the real story. The real story was that one person chose evidence over emotion, principle over pride, and justice over personal victory, proving that the strongest voice inside any courtroom is not the loudest one. It is the one that never stops telling the truth. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.